Good evening, and welcome back. There is something that happens when you stand in a crowd in London, and then stand in a crowd in Paris, or Rome, or Madrid. It is not something that is easy to put into words, and most people who notice it never say it out loud, because it sounds like the kind of observation that invites argument. But the observation is real, and it is not imaginary, and it is not bigotry, and it is not a stereotype. It is a pattern that geneticists, archaeologists, and evolutionary biologists have spent decades trying to explain. The British, taken as a whole, look different from other Europeans, not radically, not in a way that makes them unrecognizable as Europeans at all, but different enough that the difference is measurable, genetically documented, and traceable across 12,000 years of history. The pale skin that burns rather than tans, the high frequency of blue and gray eyes, the red and auburn hair that appears in every generation at rates found almost nowhere else on Earth outside the Atlantic fringe, the specific bone structure of the face, the height distribution, all of it is real, all of it is documented, and all of it has a cause. The cause is not what most people think it is. It is not the result of isolation. Exactly. Though isolation played a role, it is not the result of racial purity, because the British Isles have been invaded, colonized, and genetically remade so many times that the word purity is almost comically inappropriate. It is the result of a specific sequence of population events that happened in a specific order, at a specific time, amplified by geography, shaped by disease, filtered by selection pressure, and locked in by the particular dynamics of island populations. The story of why the British look the way they do is the story of Britain itself, reaching back past the Romans, past the Celts, past the Bronze Age, all the way to a time when Britain was not even an island. This is that story. It takes 12,000 years to tell properly. We are going to tell it tonight. If you want more history like this, subscribe now and hit the bell. These stories disappear from feeds without warning, and the next one is already waiting for you. The story does not begin in England. It does not begin in Britain at all, because Britain as an island did not yet exist. It begins with a vast, flat, low-lying landmass that connected what is now southeastern England to what is now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Geologists and archaeologists call this landmass Dogland, named after the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank in the North Sea that is one of its last visible remnants above water. For most of the last ice age, this was land, real, walkable, huntable, livable land, and people lived on it. The world at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, looked nothing like it does today. Sea levels were significantly lower because enormous quantities of water were locked up in glaciers and ice sheets. Britain was not separated from continental Europe. You could walk from what is now Norfolk to what is now Denmark without getting your feet wet. You could walk from what is now Devon across to Brittany. The English Channel was a river valley. The Thames was a tributary of a much larger river system that drained much of northwestern Europe into the ocean, far to the west of where the Atlantic coastline stands today. The people who lived in Dogland were hunter-gatherers. They were not farmers. They did not have permanent settlements. They followed the herds of red deer and aurochs. They fished the rivers. They gathered hazelnuts and berries. They understood the land the way that only people who depend on it for survival can understand. Land. Genetically, these people belong to a group that scientists call Western hunter-gatherers, a population that had spread across Europe following the retreat of the glaciers, moving northward and westward as the ice pulled back and the land became habitable again. What did these people look like? The answer to this question is one of the most startling things that ancient DNA research has produced in the last 15 years, and it is directly relevant to understanding why the British look the way they do today. The Western hunter-gatherers of northwestern Europe were not pale. They were dark-skinned, not dark in the sense of sub-Saharan African populations, but significantly darker than the skin tone most people associate with Northern European ancestry today. They had dark or very dark brown skin, and many of them had blue eyes. The combination sounds paradoxical to modern eyes because we have come to associate blue eyes with very pale skin. But genetics does not respect our expectations. The variants in the genome that control skin pigmentation and the variants that control eye color are largely separate. And for most of human prehistory in Europe, blue eyes and dark skin coexisted perfectly well. The most famous individual from this population is known as Cheddar Man. He was found in Gough's Cave in Somerset, in the Cheddar Gorge, which is one of the most archaeologically significant sites in Britain. His remains date to approximately 10,000 years ago, making him one of the oldest, near-complete human skeletons ever found in the British Isles. In 2018, a team of scientists from University College London and the Natural History Museum used ancient DNA extracted from a fragment of his petrous bone, the hardest bone in the human skull, to reconstruct his appearance. The results made international headlines. Chedman had dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. He looked nothing like the pale, fair-haired ancient Briton of Victorian imagination. Chedman was not an anomaly. He was representative of his population, the Western hunter-gatherers who inhabited Britain and northwestern Europe at the end of the time. Ice Age all shared this profile to varying degrees: dark pigmentation, high frequency of non-brown eyes, robust physique, suited to a demanding hunter-gatherer lifestyle. These were the first Britons in any meaningful sense of the word. They had been in the region since the ice retreated, and they had lived there for thousands of years before anything changed. In Gough's Cave itself, evidence of far earlier human occupation was also found, including butchered human bones that showed signs of cannibalism dating back 14,000 years. The people of this region had a complex and layered relationship with the landscape and with each other across deep time. But the Western hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, were the dominant population of Britain. They hunted, they fished, they camped, they built temporary shelters, and then slowly at first, and then with increasing momentum, the world changed around them. The sea was rising. This is the central geographic fact of early British prehistory. As the glaciers melted, meltwater poured into the oceans, and sea levels rose at a rate that, while slow by human standards, was catastrophic over the time scale of generations. Dogland began to flood. First, the low-lying areas, the river valleys and the coastal plains, then the higher ground. Storms pushed seawater further inland. Islands formed where there had been continuous land. The population of Dogland was compressed, pushed westward and northward, forced onto higher ground as their ancestral territory disappeared beneath the waves. Modern surveys of the North Seafoe have found evidence of ancient human habitation. Hearths, worked flint, the bones of hunted animals, all preserved under meters of seawater. The people who lived there had to leave. Some of them came to Britain. Some came to Scandinavia. Some were simply overtaken by the sea. By approximately 8,000 years ago, Britain was an island, not yet fully separated from Ireland, but separated from continental Europe. The English Channel had opened. The North Sea had filled. The island that would eventually be called Britain was now geographically isolated, a situation with profound consequences for everything that would follow. Island populations evolved differently from continental populations. They experience genetic drift more intensely. Traits that might be diluted by constant gene flow from adjacent populations on a continent can become fixed in island populations simply through isolation. The island status of Britain is not incidental to the story of why the British look different. It is fundamental to it. For several thousand years after the island formed, the Western hunter-gatherers continued to live their Mesolithic existence, hunting, fishing, gathering. They occupied a landscape that was heavily forested, full of game, threaded with rivers full of salmon. They were not numerous by modern standards, perhaps tens of thousands across the entire island. Their communities were small and mobile. They left behind their flint tools, their hearth sites, their maidens, and their bones. And then, around 6,000 years ago, everything changed. The change came from the southeast. It came from people who were not hunter-gatherers, but farmers, people who grew wheat and barley, who kept cattle and sheep, who lived in permanent or semi-permanent settlements, who built monuments out of wood and then out of stone. These were the Neolithic farmers, and they had originated far to the east in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, and had been spreading slowly westward across Europe for thousands of years, following the river valleys and the coastlines, bringing their crops and their animals and their way of life with them. The Neolithic farmers arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago, and their arrival changed the island profoundly. Not immediately, and not all at once, but over several generations, the population of Britain was transformed. Ancient DNA studies have now made this transformation legible. The Neolithic farmers who came to Britain were genetically distinct from the Western hunter-gatherers who were already there. They carried a different suite of ancestral markers, tracing their ancestry back through the first farming communities of Europe to the agricultural heartlands of the Near East. Crucially, they were also somewhat less dark-skinned than the hunter-gatherers, though they were still significantly darker than modern Northern Europeans. They had brown eyes predominantly. They were shorter. They had different skull shapes, which is why 19th-century archaeologists, who had no concept of ancient DNA, could sometimes distinguish mythic and Neolithic remains by morphology alone. What happened to the Western hunter-gatherers when the farmers arrived? The honest answer is that we do not entirely know. There is no evidence of a single catastrophic conflict, no archaeological massacre site that marks the moment when one population displaced another. What the genetic record shows is that over several centuries, the proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the British population declined significantly, while Neolithic farmer ancestry increased. Some interbreeding happened. The Neolithic farmers in Britain carry a small but detectable proportion of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, which means that some mixing occurred. But the primary dynamic was replacement. The farming way of life, with its ability to support larger populations on the same area of land, simply outcompeted the hunter-gatherer way of life. The farmers had more children. They built more settlements. They cleared more forest. They left less room for the people who had been there before. The Neolithic farmers built Stonehenge, not the final version that stands today, but the earliest phases of the monument. They built Avery, which is actually larger than Stonehenge, and arguably more impressive. They built the passage tombs of the Boone Valley in Ireland, including Newgrange, which is older than Stonehenge, and older than the pyramids of Giza. They built Scarabra in Orne, a perfectly preserved stone village that gives an extraordinary window into life in Neolithic Britain. These people were sophisticated, they were organized, they had a complex ritual life, and they were the dominant population of Britain for roughly 2,000 years. And then they too were replaced. The second great population replacement in British prehistory began around 4,400 years ago, at the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It is called the Beaker migration, named after the distinctive style of pottery that these Iflu carried with them across Europe. Bell-shaped drinking vessels found in graves from what is now Portugal to what is now Poland. The Beaker people, or at least the eastern wave of them that reached Britain, were originally from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea that are now part of Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. They had moved westward into Central Europe in an earlier migration, mixing with local populations there, and then a branch of them moved further west still, into Western Europe, and eventually across the water to Britain. What the Beaker migration did to Britain is by any measure one of the most dramatic population events in European prehistory. Ancient DNA studies, most notably a landmark paper published in Nature in 2018 by David Reich's group at Harvard, showed that within a few centuries of the Beaker arrival, approximately 90% of the ancestry of the British population had been replaced. 90%, almost complete population replacement. The Neolithic farmers who had built Stonehenge and Avery and Scarabra were almost entirely gone, genetically speaking, replaced by people who came ultimately from the steppe grasslands of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The mechanism of this replacement is intensely debated. The plague hypothesis has gained significant traction in recent years. Ancient DNA researchers have found evidence that the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the Black Death, was present in Europe during this period, possibly spreading through the dense Neolithic farming populations in a form that was not yet the bubonic plague of the medieval period, but was still extremely lethal. If a disease pandemic swept through the Neolithic farmers of Britain, reducing their population dramatically, it would have created a demographic vacuum into which the Beaker migrants could move and expand rapidly. Other researchers emphasized social and economic advantages. The steppe populations brought with them horses, wheel technology, and a different social structure. Whatever the mechanism, the result is not in doubt. Britain, after the Beaker transition, was a genetically different place from Britain before it. The people who replaced the Neolithic farmers were also visually different from them. The steppe ancestry that the Beaker people carried was associated with genetic variants linked to lighter skin pigmentation, not the palest possible skin, but significantly lighter than the Neolithic farmers, and was dramatically lighter than the Western hunter-gatherers who had been there first. The Beaker people and their descendants in Britain carried higher frequencies of the genetic variants at loci like SLC 455A2 and SLC 24A5 that reduced melanin production in skin. They were on average the lightest-skinned population that Britain had seen. They were also taller on average than the Neolithic farmers they replaced. The stepper ancestry that the Beakers brought is associated with genetic variants that predisposed to greater height, and they carried another trait that would become extremely significant in British history: a high frequency of variants associated with lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood. Most humans, like most mammals, lose the ability to digest lactose after infancy. In a pastoral society that kept cattle and depended on dairy products, individuals who could continue to drink fresh milk into adulthood had a significant nutritional advantage. The Beaker people and their descendants had among the highest rates of lactase persistence of LACFA any population that had yet lived in Britain. And that trait was passed down through the generations to modern British populations, who today have some of the highest rates of lactase persistence in the world. The Bronze Age in Britain, which followed the Beaker transition, was therefore populated by people who were in genetic terms quite different from either the Western hunter-gatherers or the Neolithic farmers who had preceded them. They were lighter-skinned, taller, capable of digesting dairy, and they carried a substantial proportion of steppe ancestry, alongside a remaining fraction of earlier European farming ancestry. The specific mix varied by region and changed gradually over time, but the steppe signal was dominant, and it persisted. The Iron Age, which began in Britain around 800 years before the Common Era, brought cultural changes and population movements, but the genetic evidence suggests that these were relatively modest in comparison to what had come before. The people who are often described as Celts in popular history, the populations of Iron Age Britain and Ireland, who spoke early forms of what would become Welsh, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and Breton, were broadly continuous with the Beaker Bronze Age population. There was movement and mixing, as there always is, but there was no dramatic population replacement on the scale of the Neolithic or the Beaker transition. The Iron Age Britain looked genetically broadly like a continued evolution of the Beaker population, with regional variations reflecting local patterns of movement and drift. The Picts of northern Scotland present a particularly interesting case. They left behind a distinctive tradition of carved stone monuments and a name that puzzled later writers, but are now understood as one of the Iron Age populations of Britain. Genetically, recent studies have shown that the Picts were not as exotic or isolated as some Victorian writers imagined. They were broadly part of the Iron Age British and Irish population, with some distinctive regional patterns that reflect their geographic position in the far north, but not a separate people in any genetic sense. The Roman conquest of Britain began in 43 of the Common Era, when the Emperor Claudius launched the invasion that Caesar had twice attempted and twice abandoned. For nearly 4 centuries, from 43 to 410, Britain was a province of the Roman Empire called Britannia, administered from London, defended by legions stationed along Hadrian's Wall and at fortresses throughout the island. The Romans brought home roads, cities, underfloor heating, plumbing, written records, wine, olive oil, and soldiers from every corner of the empire, from North Africa, from Syria, from the Danube frontier, from Spain and Gaul. Did all this leave a genetic mark on the British population? The honest answer is remarkably little. For all the profound cultural, linguistic, and political impact of nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule, the genetic contribution of Roman period immigration to the modern British population appears to be quite small. Ancient DNA studies of Roman period individuals from Britain have found diverse ancestries, exactly what you would expect from a military and administrative apparatus that drew personnel from across the Mediterranean world. Individuals buried in Roman York have been found with ancestry from North Africa and the Middle East. A soldier from the Danube region was buried near Hadrian's Wall. These were real people. They lived real lives in Britain. Some of them had children with local women, and their genetic descendants may still be among us. But the Roman contribution did not fundamentally alter the genetic profile of the British population for a simple demographic reason. The pre-Roman population of Britain was probably in the low millions. The Roman administrative and military presence, while significant, was a thin layer on top of a much larger existing population. Even if every Roman soldier stationed in Britain had fathered several children with British women, the statistical dilution would have been enormous. The numbers simply did not add up to a transformation. When the Romans withdrew in the early 5th century, the underlying genetic substrate of Britain was still recognizably descended from the Belbia, Bronze Age, and Iron Age populations. The Roman centuries were a profound civilizational experience, but not a genetic one, at least not at the population level. The departure of Roman administration in the early 5th century left Britain exposed to pressures that had been building along the North Sea coast. The peoples that the Romans and later writers called Angles, Saxons, and Judes were Germanic-speaking groups from what is now the coastline of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. In the 5th and 6th centuries, they began to migrate into Britain, initially, perhaps as mercenaries or settlers invited by British leaders who needed military help, but eventually as an expanding population that displaced, absorbed, or pushed out the Romano-British population of the land areas. The scale of the Anglo-Saxon migration has been one of the most debated questions in early medieval British history. Victorian scholars imagined a wholesale replacement of the Romano-British population by invading Germanic tribes. Archaeologists in the 20th century pushed back, noting that the material evidence was complex and that cultural change does not necessarily imply population replacement. The ancient DNA evidence has now provided a resolution of sorts, and it falls between the two extremes. Studies published in Nature in 2022, based on ancient DNA from cemeteries across England, found that in individuals buried in Anglo-Saxon-style cemeteries in eastern England showed on the average approximately 60 to 70% ancestry from continental northwestern Europe. The region from which the Anglo-Saxons came, in western England, the proportions were different, with more continuity from the Romano-British population. In Cornwall, Wales, and other parts of the western north, the Romano-British population continued largely unbroken. The migration had been real, it had been substantial, and it had significantly changed the genetic makeup of what is now England, but it had not erased the existing population everywhere. Instead, it had created a patchwork with the highest Anglo-Saxon ancestry in the east, and decreasing proportions as you moved westward. The overall contribution of Anglo-Saxon migration to modern English ancestry has been estimated at roughly 25 to 40%. This is a significant fraction, second only to the Belbia Bronze Age contribution, but it did not remake the population from scratch. The existing Beaker and Iron Age ancestry persisted alongside it in proportions that varied by location. What the Anglo-Saxons did bring, in terms of visible traits, was reinforcement of some of the pigmentation variants already present in the population. Since the northwestern European populations from which they came shared many genetic variants, with the Beaker-derived British population, the net effect on appearance was probably modest in absolute terms, though it may have slightly increased the average frequency of light pigmentation variants in the eastern land areas. The Viking Age, which affected Britain from the late 8th century through the 11th century, added another layer to the genetic portrait. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, primarily from what is now Denmark and Norway, and they raided, traded, settled, and ultimately ruled over significant portions of Britain. The Danelaw, the area of England, roughly north and east, of a line from London to Chester, was under Viking political control for much of the 9th and 10th centuries. Viking settlers established Jorvik, now York, as a major trading city. Norse settlers colonized Orne and Shetland, as well as the northern and western Isles of Tame, Scotland, and were a dominant presence in Ireland and the Isle of Man. The genetic contribution of the Vikings to modern British ancestry is detectable but variable by region. In the mainland English population, the Viking contribution is estimated at roughly 6% on average, which is modest compared to the Anglo-Saxon contribution. This is partly because the Danish Vikings, who colonized the Danelaw, came from a population that was already genetically similar to the Anglo-Saxons in many respects, making it difficult to disentangle their contribution statistically, and partly because many of the Norse settlers in the Danelaw eventually assimilated into the existing Anglo-Saxon population without leaving a dramatically distinct genetic signal. In Orne and Shetland, the picture is entirely different. The pre-Viking population of these islands was almost entirely replaced by Norse settlers, and modern Orcadians have Norse ancestry levels of roughly 30% or more, making them genetically the most distinct population in the modern United Kingdom. A major genetic study of the British Isles, published in 2015 by a team at Oxford, found that Orkney forms its own distinct and genetic cluster, clearly separated from the rest of Scotland, with a genetic profile that sits between Scandinavia and mainland Scotland on a principal component: analysis. The Vikings did not just raid in Orkney, they stayed, they multiplied, and their genetic signature is still legible in the people who live there today. The Norman conquest of 1066 is one of the most famous events in British history, but its genetic impact was surprisingly limited. The Normans, who followed William the Conqueror across the Channel, were the descendants of Norse Vikings, who had settled in northern France a century and a half earlier and had adopted the French language and Frankish culture. They were therefore a mixture of Norse and Frankish ancestry, with some additional contributions from the diverse population of northern France. When they conquered England, they installed themselves as a new ruling elite, displacing the existing Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and clergy. But the Normans were a thin elite layer on top of a much larger English population. Estimates of the total number of Normans who came to England in the decades after the conquest range from around 10,000 to perhaps 20,000, against an existing English population of perhaps 1.5 to 2 million. Even if the Normans reproduced prolifically, the mathematical impact on the gene pool of the total population was inevitably small. Modern genetic studies bear this out. The Norman contribution to modern English ancestry is estimated at a few percent at most. The conquest that transformed English law, language, and culture left only a faint genetic fingerprint. The medieval period also saw smaller but cumulatively significant migrations into Britain. Flemish weavers, primarily from what is now Belgium and northern France, settled in Wales and eastern England in considerable numbers during the 12th and 13th centuries, invited by English and Welsh lords who valued their textile skills. Jewish communities, who had been present in England since the Norman period, were expelled in 1290 by Edward II in an act of ethnic cleansing that removed tens of thousands of people and their descendants from the gene pool. A reminder that population history is not only about who arrived, but also about who was forced to leave. Hanseatic merchants from the Baltic settled in trading communities in London and eastern five coastal towns. The Black Death of 1348 and 1349, which killed perhaps a third to a half of the English population in 2 years, had a profound, if indirect, genetic effect. A plague of that severity does not kill randomly. It kills preferentially in some populations and spares others. And those who survived and reproduced after the Black Death passed on their immune system, genetics to subsequent generations at a higher rate than those who died. Researchers have found signals in modern European genomes that are consistent with strong selection at immune system lossy, particularly in the HLA gene complex, during the medieval period. The Black Death may have changed the immune genetics of the British population in ways that are still detectable today. By the end of the medieval period, then the genetic profile of Britain was a layered composite. The dominant layer, quantitatively, was still the Belbea Bronze Age ancestry, modified by Iron Age continuity. Above it lay a significant Anglo-Saxon contribution, geographically variable but substantial in the Eastern Midlands. Above that, a thin layer of Viking ancestry, highest in Orne and Shetland, detectable in parts of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, minimal in the western south, and above all of that, an almost invisible Norman layer. The western hunter-gatherer ancestry from the people of Dogland was still present as a small, residual fraction, the oldest stratum of the genetic archaeological record, and mixed through everything were the consequences of selection, drift, and the particular dynamics of island life. Now the question of appearance must be addressed more directly. All of these population events happened, all of these migrations and replacements and mixings occurred. But why did the result look the way it did? Why did Britain end up with higher frequencies of pale skin, blue eyes, and red hair than almost anywhere else on the continent? Skin color in humans is controlled by a relatively small number of genes, each of which affects the production and distribution of melanin in the skin. The key variants in the European context are found in genes with the unglamorous names of Celtov A2, SLC24, A5TWAR1, and a handful of others. The derived alleles at these low-key, the variants that reduce melanin production, are associated with lighter skin. They were not universal in early European populations. The Western hunter-gatherers had relatively low frequencies of light pigmentation variants. The Neolithic farmers had somewhat higher frequencies. The Beaker steppe people brought still higher frequencies with them. And at each stage, selection pressure seems to have reinforced the trend toward lighter pigmentation. The selection pressure for lighter skin at high latitudes is related to vitamin D synthesis. Human skin synthesizes vitamin D when exposed to ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. At the latitude of Britain, which sits between roughly 50 and 60 degrees north, the sun is lower in the sky for most of the year. The days are shorter in winter, and cloud cover is frequent. The UV radiation reaching the skin is substantially less than at lower latitudes. For a population that depended on sunlight for vitamin D synthesis, darker skin, which blocks UV radiation more effectively, became a liability. Individuals with lighter skin could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently from the available sunlight, reducing their risk of rickets, improving their immune function, and enhancing their reproductive outcomes in subtle but cumulative ways over many generations. This selection pressure was not unique to Britain. It operated across Northern Europe, but it operated on whatever genetic starting material happened to be present. In Britain, the starting material after the Beaker transition was a population that had already moved some distance along the spectrum toward lighter pigmentation, and the combination of continued selection and island drift pushed it further. The result, accumulated over 3,000 to 4,000 years, is the distribution of skin tones seen in modern British populations, running from the pale, almost translucent skin that burns within minutes of sun exposure to the slightly warmer tones seen more frequently in some regions, but centered decisively toward the lighter end of the European spectrum. Eye color has a different, and in some ways, simpler story. The most common bluey color variant in Europe traces to a single mutation at a regulatory region near the OCA2 gene, a mutation that reduces the expression of OCA2 and thereby reduces melanin production in the iris. This mutation appears to have originated once in a single individual somewhere in Stolthers-Toothry, northwestern Europe, probably between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Every blue-eyed person in the world today is descended from that individual, or at least carries the same rare original mutation at that specific location in the genome. The descendants of this mutation are found at their highest frequencies in Scandinavia and the Baltic, but they are also extremely common in Britain and Ireland. Approximately 50 to 60% of people in the United Kingdom have blue or grey eyes, compared to roughly 30 to 40% in Germany and France, and much lower proportions in southern Europe. The distribution maps neatly onto the regions where ancient DNA suggests the highest combined influence of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, which already had elevated bluey frequencies, and Beaker steppe ancestry, combined with millennia of selection in low UV environments. The story of red hair is particularly interesting, and particularly British, or more precisely, particularly Atlantic. The MC1R gene controls the type of melanin produced in hair and skin. The common form produces predominantly eumelanin, which gives hair its brown and black tones, and skin its ability to tan. Variants in MC1R, particularly a cluster of variants that are especially common in Britain and Ireland, shift the balance toward the lanin, which is the reddish-yellow pigment. Hair with high phenylanin levels is red or a burn. Skin with high phenylanin levels is fair to the point of translucency, freckled, and extremely sensitive to UV radiation, which is why redheads burn rather than tan, and often have more freckles than non-redheads. Between 10 and 15% of the population of the United Kingdom carries enough copies of these MC1R variants to have red or hair as adults, compared to roughly 3 to 4% in Germany, 1 to 2% in France, and fractions of a percent in most of the rest of the world outside the Atlantic fringe. In Ireland and Western Scotland, the frequencies are even higher, sometimes reaching 20% or more in localized populations. These regions of the Atlantic fringe, Ireland, Western Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany and France, the Basque Country in Spain, show the highest red hair frequencies in the world. Why? The answer involves both drift and possibly selection. The MC1R variants, associated with red hair, appear to be quite old in the European population. They were probably present in low frequencies, in the Western hunter-gatherers, and in the Neolithic farmers, as populations moved along the Atlantic fringe and were subjected to founder effects and drift. Small initial differences in AL frequency could become amplified. A small founding population, in which a few individuals happened to carry red hair variants, could, over many generations of relative isolation, produce a descendant population with much higher SAS frequencies of those variants. The western and northern edges of the British Isles, particularly Ireland, the Scottish, Highlands and Islands and Wales, experienced exactly this kind of geographic isolation on the smaller scales, and the result was the preservation and amplification of red hair at frequencies that are essentially unmatched elsewhere. There may also be a selection component in very low UV environments. Even the slight reduction in vitamin D synthesis caused by pale skin with freckles, might be offset by other advantages, or the selection against it might have been too weak to overcome the drift effects. Some researchers have proposed that freckles, which are clusters of high melanin cells, may represent a compromise, providing some UV protection in specific exposed spots, while allowing the surrounding skin to synthesize vitamin D. The debate has not been fully resolved, but what is clear is that the Atlantic fringe is where red hair found its refuge, and Britain and Ireland are its heartland. Lacked persistence deserves a brief return visit because it is one of the clearest examples of how selection has shaped the British population in ways that are both genetically detectable and phenotypically relevant. The ability to digest lactose into adulthood is controlled primarily by a single variant, upstream of the LCT gene, a variant that keeps the lactase enzyme switched on throughout life, rather than allowing it to switch off after infancy. This variant appears to have been favored by natural selection in European populations that kept dairy cattle because fresh milk is an enormously valuable source of calories, fat, and nutrients for a population that raises animals specifically for milk production. The variant is extremely common in modern British populations, with some surveys finding frequencies of over 90% in parts of England. This is among the highest in the world. The high frequency reflects both the strong selection pressure that existed in a pastoral, dairy culture, and the fact that the Beaker people, who dominated Britain's Bronze Age ancestry, came from a steppe culture in which cattle, herring, and dairy production played a central role. The combination of a pre-adaptation in the founding population and continued strong selection over 3,000 to 4,000 years produced the extraordinarily high lactose persistence rates seen in Britain today. Height also bears mentioning, though it is more complex than skin or eye color because it is controlled by thousands of genetic variants rather than a handful. The steppe ancestry that the Beaker people brought to Britain is associated with alas that predisposed to greater height, and modern studies of ancient DNA have confirmed that the post-Beaker population of Britain was on average taller than the Neolithic farmers who preceded them. The Anglo-Saxons who arrived in the 5th and 6th centuries came from a population with similar height genetics. The net result, after all the layers of migration and mixing, is a modern British population that ranks among the taller populations in Europe, though not dramatically more so than nearby continental populations with similar ancestry compositions. In 2015, a team of researchers at Oxford University published a landmark study in the journal Nature that remains one of the most comprehensive genetic surveys of the British Isles ever conducted. The study analyzed the genomes of 2,309 white British individuals from across the UK, choosing only people whose 4 grandparents had all been born within 35 miles of each other to ensure that the genetic patterns they found reflected deep historical structure rather than recent migration. They identified 17 distinct genetic clusters within the British Isles. These clusters did not correspond to the modern nations of Britain and Ireland in a simple way, but they did correspond, sometimes with startling precision, to ancient historical and administrative boundaries. The genetic boundary between East Anglia and the rest of England aligned closely with the boundary of the old DNA law. The distinction between Orkney and mainland Scotland was clear and pronounced. Welsh people formed a distinct cluster, carrying higher levels of ancient British ancestry than English people. People from Cornwall formed a cluster that was distinct from the rest of the southwest, reflecting the long survival of Celtic Cornish culture and partial genetic isolation. People from Yorkshire and the East Midlands showed patterns consistent with their higher Anglo-Saxon and Viking ancestry. The Orkin cluster was the most distinct. When the researchers plotted these British clusters on a principal component analysis, alongside modern European populations, The Acadians sat clearly between Scandinavia and mainland Scotland, exactly where you would expect them to sit, given their substantial Norse ancestry. The Welsh cluster sat close to what the researchers described as the genetic profile of ancient, Iron Age, and Bronze Age British populations, suggesting that Wales had retained more of the pre-Anglo-Saxon genetic profile than most of England. The English clusters showed a clear gradient from east to west, with eastern populations showing more affinity to continental northwestern European populations, and western populations showing more continuity with the earlier British substrate. Comparing Britain's overall genetic position to the rest of Europe clarifies the picture further. When geneticists plot modern European populations on a principal component analysis, the British and Irish populations cluster at the northwestern extreme of the European genetic landscape, close to Scandinavia and relatively distant from southern European populations, like Italians, Greeks, and Iberians. This position reflects the specific combination of ancestries that predominate in Britain: the high Beaker steppe ancestry, the Anglo-Saxon ancestry from northwestern Europe, and the relatively lower Neolithic farmer ancestry compared to southern Europe, all contribute to this positioning. France is an instructive comparison. The French population taken as a whole sits considerably further toward the center of the European genetic landscape than the British. This is because France has a higher proportion of Neolithic farmer ancestry from Anatolia relative to Beaker steppe ancestry. The French also have lower frequencies of the specific pigmentation ALIS associated with very pale skin and blue eyes, higher frequencies of brown eye variants, and much lower frequencies of red hair, MC1R variants outside of Brittany. The genetic distance between the British and the French is measurable and real, even though, geographically, they are separated only by the English Channel at its narrowest point. That narrow channel, combined with the island dynamics it has imposed on British population history, has been sufficient to create a distinct genetic profile. Germany is a more interesting comparison than France, because the German population contributed substantially to Britain via the Anglo-Saxon migration, and the two populations share significant Beaker ancestry. Modern English and modern German populations are therefore genetically similar in many respects, closer to each other than either is to southern European populations. But there are differences. The German population has a more complex internal structure reflecting the different histories of different German regions. And on average, the British population sits somewhat further to the northwest on the European genetic map, reflecting the particular combination of Beaker, Anglo-Saxon, and Iron Age British ancestry that characterizes England. Scandinavia deserves specific attention. Modern Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish populations are genetically relatively similar to the British, reflecting their shared Beaker Bronze Age ancestry, and in the case of Denmark, particularly the Viking contribution to British genetics. When you plot British clusters and Scandinavian populations on a genetic map, they sit in relatively close proximity compared to the enormous distance separating either from Mediterranean populations. This genetic closeness is what generates the superficial visual similarity that many people notice between British, Scandinavian, and northern German populations. The high frequency of light hair, blue eyes, and pale skin, these are not coincidental resemblances. They reflect real shared ancestry from the Bronze Age and beyond. Scotland and Wales and Ireland each deserve brief individual treatment because they diverge from the English pattern in instructive ways. Scotland is genetically the most internally diverse of the British nations. The Scottish Highlands and Islands carry higher levels of ancient British ancestry than the Scottish lands, which show more Anglo-Saxon influence. Orkney and Shetland, as discussed, carry substantial Norse ancestry. The Gaelic-speaking areas of the northwest of Scotland have maintained a genetic distinctiveness that reflects both their geographic isolation and their cultural continuity. Modern Scots carry a mixture of ancient British, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and other influences that varies considerably by region. Wales is genetically the most conservative of the British nations in the sense of carrying the highest levels of ancient pre-Anglo-Saxon British ancestry. The Anglo-Saxon migration stopped roughly at the Welsh border for the most part, because the Welsh maintained their political independence, their Celtic language, and their cultural identity throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The genetic consequence is that Welsh people today carry on average a higher proportion of Belbie and Iron Age British ancestry than English people do, with correspondingly lower proportions of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. This is why the Welsh genetic cluster in the Oxford 2015 study sat closest to what the researchers modeled as the ancient British population. The Welsh are in a meaningful genetic sense the most ancient of the British peoples. Ireland presents yet another profile. Ireland was settled by Neolithic farmers and Belbia Bronze Age people in the same general sequence as Britain, but it never experienced the Anglo-Saxon migration or the Norman settlement in any demographically significant way. The Norman presence in Ireland was geographically limited and eventually largely assimilated into the existing Gaelic population. The result is that modern Irish people carry on average even higher levels of the Beaker, Bronze Age steppe ancestry than the English, with a very high ancient Western hunter-gatherer component, as well, making Ireland genetically closer to the oldest layers of British and European prehistory than any modern English population. The high levels of red hair in Ireland are partly a consequence of this ancient genetic substrate, amplified by thousands of years of geographic isolation on an island off the coast of an island. The ancient DNA revolution that made all of this knowledge possible is worth understanding in Tucan Selv, because it is genuinely one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the early 21st century. For most of history, the only way to understand the genetic history of human populations was to study living people and work backwards. This approach, called population genetics, produced important insights, but was limited by the fact that you could never directly observe the past. You could only infer it from the present. Ancient DNA changed everything. The key breakthrough, largely credited to Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, was developing techniques to extract, sequence, and interpret DNA from very old bones. Human DNA degrades after death. It is attacked by bacteria, by water, by heat, by oxygen. In most environments, there is no usable DNA left in a bone after 1,000 years. But in some conditions, cold, dry, slightly acidic environments, DNA can survive for tens of thousands of years. The petrous bone, the densest bone in the skull, concentrates DNA in a way that gives researchers the best chance of finding usable, ancient genetic material. By the early 2010s, ancient DNA research had advanced to the point where teams led by David Reich at Harvard, Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute, and Ponto Skoglund at the Crick Institute could sequence full genomes from thousands of ancient individuals from across Europe and the world. The results produced a revolution in understanding human prehistory that has made many previous frameworks obsolete. Population replacement events that were suspected from archaeology could now be confirmed or denied. Migration routes that were proposed on the basis of artifact distributions could now be validated or refuted. The actual faces of the past could be reconstructed, at least in statistical terms, with a fidelity that no previous method could approach. For Britain specifically, the ancient DNA revolution confirmed the Bell-Beaker transition as the most dramatic population event in British prehistory, documented the Anglo-Saxon migration with a precision that had been impossible from archaeology alone, revealed the persistence of pre-Roman British ancestry in Wales and Western Scotland, and showed that the genetic structure of modern Britain was already substantially in place by the Dia. early medieval period. David Reich's 2018 book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, is the most accessible account of this revolution for general readers, and it transformed public understandings of human prehistory when it was published. Modern genetic testing companies have provided an additional layer of evidence that, while less rigorous than academic ancient DNA studies, is consistent with them in broad outline. When millions of people in Britain and Ireland have had their DNA tested by companies like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, the results confirm the broad patterns visible in the academic literature. People from Eastern England show higher proportions of ancestry from continental northwestern Europe. People from Wales and Western Scotland show higher proportions of ancestry that the companies label as broadly British or Celtic. People from Orkney show distinctively high Scandinavian ancestry. The regional genetic structure that the Oxford 2015 study documented is visible in the consumer testing data too. One of the most profound implications of the ancient DNA evidence is what it tells us about the relationship between language and genetics in Britain. The Celtic languages, Welsh, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Cornish, Man's, and formerly Pictish, were the languages spoken across Britain and Ireland before the Roman conquest, and for much of the first millennium of the Common Era. Today, they survive only in the westernmost and northernmost refuse, pushed there by the expansion of English from the east. And when you map the genetic clusters showing the highest ancient British ancestry, they correspond almost exactly to the areas where Celtic languages survived the longest. Wales, which has the highest ancient British ancestry of any British region, is the area where Welsh is still spoken. The Western Highlands of Scotland, where Gaelic survived into the 20th century, show higher ancient British ancestry than the lowlands. The correlation is not perfect because language shift and genetic shift do not always move together, but it is strong enough to be striking. This correlation suggests that the expansion of English across Britain was not purely a cultural phenomenon, but had a significant demographic component. Anglo-Saxon settlement genuinely displaced or replaced significant numbers of the existing Romano-British population in eastern England, and this demographic reality was reflected in the linguistic outcome. The areas that maintained Celtic languages were also the areas that maintained the highest levels of pre-Anglo-Saxon ancestry, not because language preservation causes genetic preservation, but because both language and genetics reflect the underlying demographic history. The Channel Islands, sitting in the Bay of St. Malo and geographically much closer to Normandy than to England, present a fascinating intermediate case. Genetically, Channel Islanders show a profile that sits between the British and French populations, reflecting their ambiguous history as territories that were part of the Duchy of Normandy before 1066, became attached to the English crown as a consequence of the conquest, but were never fully anglicized in population terms. Their Norman French dialects, now almost extinct but still spoken by a handful of elderly people, and their legal system, which still draws on Norman customary law, reflect a historical identity that their genetics also partially mirror. The politics of all of this knowledge require careful handling. The genetic history of Britain confirms with absolute clarity that there is no such thing as a pure or original British people. The concept of racial or ethnic purity applied to Britain is not only morally objectionable, but factually absurd. The island was populated in its present configuration by migrants. It was almost entirely replaced once during the Belbia transition. It was substantially modified by Anglo-Saxon migration. It was reshaped in parts by Viking settlement. Every person alive in Britain today is the descendant of migrants. Whether those migrants arrived up 12,000 years ago or 12 years ago, the only question is when the migration happened, and that is a question of history, not of authenticity. At the same time, the genetic distinctiveness that the research documents is real. The British population does have a specific genetic profile that reflects its specific history, and that profile generates the specific distribution of physical traits that people notice when they look at a crowd in London versus a crowd in Rome. Acknowledging that the distinctiveness is real does not require endorsing any particular political position about immigration or national identity. It requires only the recognition that history is complicated, that the past is layered, and that the bodies of living people are a kind of archive in which that layered history is preserved. The Iceland and Faroe Islands comparison is worth dwelling on briefly, because these two small island societies in the North Atlantic represent extreme cases of the island dynamics that have in a milder form shaped Britain. Iceland was settled in the 9th century by Norse Vikings and Irish and Scottish women, many of them brought as slaves or settlers from the Viking settlements in the British Isles. The founding population was small, perhaps a few thousand people. Since then, Iceland has been geographically isolated, economically self-contained, and genetically relatively closed. The result is one of the most distinctive genetic profiles in Europe, shaped by extreme founder effects and centuries of drift. Genetic variants that are rare in mainland Scandinavia can be common in Iceland simply because one of the original settlers happened to carry them. The Faroe Islands show similar dynamics on an even smaller scale. Britain is not Iceland. It has been far more connected to continental Europe than Iceland ever was, far more subject to ongoing gene flow, far more demographically complex. But the principle is the same. Islands amplify genetic differences. They lock in founder effects. They allow drift to operate more powerfully than it does in continental populations. The specific combination of traits that the British population shows, the high pale skin frequency, the high blue eye frequency, the extraordinary red hair frequency in the Atlantic fringe. These are all partly the product of island dynamics, operating over millennia on a population that started with a particular ancestral composition. The future of this genetic profile is uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself historically illuminating. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries transformed Britain from a largely rural society in which most people were born, lived, and died within a few miles of each other into an urbanized mobile society in which internal migration became common. People from Ireland came to Liverpool and Glasgow. People from rural Wales came to the coal valleys and then to London. People from rural Yorkshire came to Leeds and Bradford. Internal migration within Britain increased, blurring the regional genetic distinctions that had accumulated over centuries of relative local isolation. The 20th century brought international migration on a scale and from a diversity of origins that Britain had never previously experienced. Communities from South Asia, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from East Africa, from China, from Eastern Europe, from the Middle East, settled in British cities and towns. Their children and grandchildren are British. Their grandchildren's children will be British. They are contributing new strands to the genetic tapestry of Britain, continuing a process of population movement and mixing that has been underway since before Dogland sank beneath the North Sea. The red-haired, blue-eyed, pale-kinned Briton of the popular imagination is a real genetic type, but it is a type with a specific historical explanation, not a permanent or essential characteristic of a land or a people. 12,000 years from now, if there are still geneticists studying ancient DNA, the people of whatever Britain then is will look back through their archive of bones and genomes and find in the early 21st century another layer in the palimpsest, another wave of migration, adding its contribution to the ongoing, never-finished story of who lives on this island and why they look the way they do. What the ancient DNA revolution has given us is something that no previous generation could have had: access to the voices of the dead, not their words, but their bodies, their ancestry, their biology, a tooth in a museum case, a fure in an archive drawer, a petrous bone wrapped in acid-free tissue. Each of them carries in its crystals a message from the past, encrypted in a code that we have only recently learned to read. And when we read it, what we find is not simplicity, but complexity, not a single origin, but a dozen origins. Not a single people, but a sequence of peoples, each inheriting the landscape from the last, each leaving their own genetic signature in the soil and the bones and the faces of their descendants. The British look the way they do because of Dogland and the sea that drowned it, because of the Western hunter-gatherers who were dark-skinned and blue-eyed and understood the land the way only people who depend on it can, because of the Neolithic farmers who came from Anatolia and built Stonehenge, because of the Belbia people who came from the steppe and were pale and tall and could drink milk and, in a few centuries, had replaced almost everyone who came before, because of the Iron Age Celts who continued and modified that Bronze Age population, because of the Romans who changed everything culturally and almost nothing genetically, because of the Anglo-Saxons who came from the coast of Germany and remade the land population of what would become England, because of the Vikings who settled Orkney so thoroughly that the island is still genetically Scandinavian, because of the Normans whose political revolution left almost no biological trace, because of the drift and the selection and the island dynamics that amplified every founder, effect, and locked in every genetic peculiarity. The pale skin burns because Dogland sank, and Britain became an island in a cloudy northern sea. And in that sea, you need every photon of sunlight you can get. The blue eyes are the eyes of hunter-gatherers who walked across land that is now ocean. The red hair is the signature of a population that found its refuge on the Atlantic fringe, and stayed there long enough for drift to amplify a rare variant into something visible on every street corner, in Dublin and Edinburgh and Cardiff. None of it was planned. None of it was inevitable. It was the product of 12,000 years of contingency, of ice melting and seas rising, of migrations and invasions, and plagues and accidents of survival, of people crossing water, because there was nothing left for them where they were, or because there was something better on Fae, or because they were told to go, or because they were taken. The bodies of living British people are the archive of all of it, written in the language of DNA, preserved in every cell, carried forward through every generation. The record of a story that did not end in 1066, or in 1945, or last Tuesday, and will not end for as long as there are people on this island making children and carrying their genomes into a future that is always in every generation being made for the first time. That is the real reason the British look different from every other European. Not because they are separate, because they are the product of a very specific sequence of separations, arrivals, replacements, and accumulations happening on an island at the northwestern edge of the world, across a span of time so long that most of it happened before writing, before cities, before anything we recognize as civilization. It is 12,000 years of history, written in skin and eyes and hair carried forward by people who never knew they were carrying it. To fully understand the British genetic profile, it is worth spending more time with each of the foundational population layers, examining not just what we know, but how we came to know it, and what the implications are when you look carefully at the details. The story is richer than any summary can capture, and in the details lie some of the most surprising and counterintuitive findings in modern genetics and archaeology. Begin again with the Western hunter-gatherers, because they are in some ways the most surprising element of the whole story. The term Western hunter-gatherer is a population genetics label. It refers to a genetically coherent group of people who inhabited Western Europe after the retreat of the last glaciation, roughly from about 15,000 years ago until the Neolithic transition began pushing them off the stage. They were not a single tribe or culture. They were a population in the genetic sense, sharing common ancestry and a distinctive combination of ancestral markers that distinguish them from other ancient human populations like the early European farmers or the Yamnaya, steppe-past pastoralists. The Western hunter-gatherers of Britain were related to, but somewhat distinct from their contemporaries in mainland Europe. The long period of relative isolation after Britain became an island meant that the British, branch of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, had time to develop its own specific characteristics through drift, even before the Neolithic farmers arrived. This island branch of the WHG population is what a very small fraction of modern British ancestry ultimately traces back to the oldest possible layer, the bedrock beneath everything else. The dark skin of the Western hunter-gatherers is worth exploring in more depth because it consistently surprises people and challenges the intuitive assumption that Northern Europe has always been home to pale-skinned populations. The genetic variants that produce pale skin in modern Europeans are, as the ancient DNA record now makes clear, relatively recent arrivals in the Northwest European gene pool. They were not present at high frequency in the hunter-gatherers. The lightkin of northwestern Europe is in large part a product of the Neolithic and Bronze Age population replacements, not a feature that was always there. The blue eyes of the Western hunter-gatherers, coexisting with their darker skin, are a particularly striking illustration of how our intuitions about the covariance of pigmentation traits mislead us. We see blue eyes and light hair together so often in modern Northern Europeans that we instinctively treat them as a package, but they are controlled by completely separate genetic systems, and in a population that had high frequencies of bluey variants but had not yet undergone the selection or founder effects that drove light skin frequency upward. The combination of blue eyes with dark or medium skin was entirely possible, and it turns out extremely common. Chedaman is the most famous exemplar of this combination, but he was not an outlier. Ancient DNA from hunter-gatherers across Europe from this period consistently shows the same pattern. A Luxembourg hunter-gatherer from around 8,000 years ago, known as Lischbohr man, had blue eyes and dark skin. Hungarian hunter-gatherers from the same period show similar profiles. Spanish hunter-gatherers called the Motella, individuals named for the site in Sweden, where some were found, also show this combination. The Western hunter-gatherers of Europe were as a population what we might describe today as having Mediterranean to olive skin tones with blue or green eyes. The pale, blue-eyed northerner of popular imagination did not exist in this period. That figure was assembled later from different components. The transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer in Britain was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over centuries, and the archaeological record shows it was complex in its social dimensions as well as its demographic ones. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain did not simply sail across the Channel and begin plowing fields. They built massive communal monuments that required substantial organization and social coordination. The long barrows of southern England, structures like West Kennet in Wiltshire, were collective burial chambers that held the bones of many individuals. They were not tombs in the individual sense, but communal repositories for the dead, used over many generations. The bones found in these long barrows belonged to the Neolithic farmers, not to the Western hunter-gatherers. This tells us something important about who the monument builders were. The people who organized the labor to drag enormous sass across the landscape. The people who designed and built the causeway enclosures that dot the Neolithic landscape of southern Britain were the farming immigrants, not the indigenous hunter-gatherers. Whether the hunter-gatherers contributed labor to these projects, whether they watched from the edges and slowly joined, whether they were excluded entirely, we cannot yet say. What we can say is that genetically, the long barrow builders were overwhelmingly Anatolian, farmer in ancestry. The Neolithic farmers themselves had a specific appearance profile. They were predominantly brownied. Their skin was somewhat lighter than the Western hunter-gatherers because they carried somewhat higher frequencies of the derived light skin alleles, possibly reflecting selection pressure in the Anatolian and Near-Eastern environments from which their ancestors came, or possibly reflecting the fact that the Neolithic lifestyle, with its more predictable food supply, and its dependence on grain crops, rather than vitamin D-rich animal products, created different selection pressures around vitamin D synthesis. They were shorter than the later Belbia people, reflecting a different ancestry and a diet that, while productive, may not have provided the same protein and fat profile as a pastoral steppe diet. The Neolithic is also when the first experiments with dairy products appear in the archaeological record of Britain. Pottery residue analysis has found traces of dairy fats in Neolithic vessels from across the British Isles, suggesting that the Neolithic farmers kept cattle partly for milk as well as for meat and traction. Whether the Neolithic farmers could digest fresh milk as adults is uncertain. Lactase persistence was not yet at the extremely high frequencies it would later reach in the Belbia-derived population. Some individuals may have had the persistence variant, most probably did not. The dairy products they consumed may often have been fermented as cheese and yogurt, which have lower lactose content than fresh milk, and can be tolerated by people without the persistence variant. The Beaker transition, which came after 2,000 years of Neolithic farming culture in Britain, is so dramatic in the ancient DNA record that it almost defies comprehension. A 90% population replacement in a few centuries is not a gradual transition. It is not a slow blending. It is something closer to a catastrophe for the existing population, whether or not violence was directly involved. The Neolithic farmers of Britain, the people who built Stonehenge and Avery, and all the long barrows and causewayed enclosures, were replaced so thoroughly that they contribute only a small minority fraction to modern British ancestry. Their monuments outlasted them by thousands of years. Their culture, their language, whatever languages they spoke, vanished with them. The Beaker people who replaced them came ultimately from the Yamnia culture of the Pontic Caspian steppe, though by the time they reached Britain, they had already spent several generations in continental Europe and were a mixture of steppe and European farmer ancestry rather than pure steppe. The steppe ancestry is distinctive in the ancient DNA record. It reflects a population that had lived for thousands of years on the vast open grasslands north of the Black Sea, herring cattle and horses, moving with the seasons, living in a landscape utterly unlike the forests and river valleys of Western Europe. They spoke an early form of what would eventually become the Indo-European language family, the ancestor of English, German, French, Spanish, Hindi, Russian, Greek, and most of the other languages now spoken across Europe and South Asia. When the Beaker-derived population replaced the Neolithic farmers of Britain, they brought the roots of what would become the Celtic languages with them, the oldest layer of British linguistic history that we can connect to specific people. The horse played a key role in the steppe expansion. The domestication of the horse, probably around 5,500 years ago, on the Pontic steppe, gave the steppe populations a mobility advantage that pastoral and agricultural populations on foot could not match. A mounted pastoralist can cover in a day the distance that takes a foot traveler a week. Herds can be moved across vast distances. Raiders can strike and withdraw before defenders can organize. Whether the steppe expansion was driven by raiding, by displacement, by the demographic edge of a population with a more productive subsistence strategy, or by the cascade effects of epidemic disease moving ahead of the migrating people, the outcome was the same. The steppe ancestry spread across Europe with extraordinary speed, and when it arrived in Britain, it was near total in its genetic impact. The Belbia people also brought something else with them that would prove extremely durable: the foundations of a social structure based on individual wealth and status rather than collective ownership. The Neolithic monuments, the long barrows and the hennies, were collective projects built by collective effort for the benefit of a community or a lineage. Belbia burials are individual, a single person, often male, buried with a set of grave goods, a beaker pot, a dagger, sometimes archery equipment, that speak to individual status and achievement. The shift from Neolithic collective burial to Beaker individual burial is one of the most dramatic transitions in the archaeological record, and it reflects a genuine change in social organization, not just in population genetics. The Bronze Age that followed the Belbia transition saw the development of increasingly complex and stratified societies in Britain. Bronze was valuable, and its production required access to copper and tin from different geographic sources, which drove long-distance trade networks. Elite warriors and chiefs accumulated wealth. A small number of extremely rich burials from the Bronze Age of Britain, like the Bush Barrow burial near Stonehenge, show individuals interred with gold ornaments, bronze weapons, and other prestige goods that speak to extraordinary personal status. The population was not egalitarian. It was stratified, with a minority of wealthy families controlling significant resources, and a majority of ordinary farmers, herders, and craftspeople below them. The genetic implications of this stratification are interesting. When a society is highly stratified, and high-status men have significantly more reproductive success than low-status men, which is a pattern seen in many historical societies. The genetic diversity of the population can be dramatically reduced from the male line. Studies of ancient DNA from Bronze Age Europe have found a striking reduction in Y chromosome diversity during this period, consistent with a small number of high-status male lineages, fathering a disproportionate share of the next generation, while many low-status men left few or no descendants. This does not mean that the Bronze Age population of Britain was genetically impoverished. Overall, because women contribute equally to the autosomal genome, and there is no evidence of similar reduction in mitochondrial diversity. But it does suggest that the social dynamics of the Belbia Bronze Age left their mark on the population in ways that were not purely about migration, but about differential reproductive success within the post-migration population. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age was, from a genetic standpoint, the most stable period in Thrace. There were no dramatic population replacements, no continental migrations of the scale that had characterized the Neolithic to Bronze Age transition. The Iron Age population of Britain was broadly continuous with the late Bronze Age population, with some regional variations reflecting local patterns of movement and mixing. The Hallstatt and Latin cultural traditions, which originated in continental Europe and spread westward to Britain, bringing the styles of art and metalwork and the ritual practices that archaeologist group under the label Celtic arrived in Britain as cultural packages rather than as the products of large-scale population movement. This means that the people who are historically called the cults in Britain were not a separate population that arrived from outside. They were the existing Belbia-derived Bronze Age population of Britain, adopting a set of cultural practices and a family of languages that had spread from continental Europe by cultural contact and limited migration, rather than by demographic replacement. The Celts were always here, in the sense that the people who became Celtic in language and culture were already in Britain. The Celtic languages spread to them, not them to the languages. This is a crucial distinction that is often misunderstood in popular history. The Roman period deserves a more careful examination than the brief treatment given earlier, because it is important to understand not just the genetic outcome, but the demographic mechanisms that produced it. Britain in the Roman period was a province of a multicultural empire, and the evidence of that multiculturalism is abundant in the archaeological record. The Roman army that garrisoned Britain was not composed of Italians. It was composed of auxiliary units recruited from across the empire, from Gaul, from Spain, from North Africa, from the Danube frontier, from Syria. These units were often stationed far from their homeland, a deliberate Roman policy to reduce the risk of local soldiers becoming too closely affiliated with local populations. Hadrian's Wall, which stretched across northern Britain from the Solway FTH to the Tin, was garrisoned by units from all over the empire. We know from inscriptions and written records that a unit of Batavians from the Rhine Delta served there. Syrians from Palmyra served there. Moors from North Africa served there. The wall was one of the most cosmopolitan frontiers in the ancient world, and in the cities of Roman Britain, particularly in London, which was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire, north of the Alps by the 2nd century, the population was similarly diverse. Merchants and administrators, and slaves and freed men came from every corner of the Mediterranean world. The archaeological evidence of this diversity is startling and continues to accumulate. Isotope analysis of teeth from Roman period burials in Britain has identified numerous individuals who spent their childhoods in southern Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East. Ancient DNA from a cemetery in Roman York identified an individual of African ancestry and another whose ancestry traced to East Asia. These were not exceptional or rare individuals in their time. Roman London and Roman York were genuinely cosmopolitan cities, yet none of this left a substantial imprint on the modern British genome, and understanding why not is instructive. The key factor is scale. The Roman urban population of Britain, diverse as it was small in absolute terms, and was concentrated in a handful of cities and along military frontiers that represented a tiny fraction of the total land area. The overwhelming majority of the population of Roman Britain lived in rural areas in farming, communities in small villages, and isolated farmsteads that maintained continuity with the pre-Roman Iron Age population. These rural communities were where most of the reproduction happened, and they were genetically far less diverse than the cities and the wall. The exotic individuals in Roman London and Roman York had children who grew up in Britain. Yes, but those children were statistically swamped by the vastly larger rural population, whose ancestry was overwhelmingly Iron Age British. There is also a survivorship issue. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Roman urban life in Britain ended in the early 5th century, the Roman cities contracted dramatically or were abandoned. London lost most of its population. The towns that had been centers of Roman administration shrank to shadows of their former selves. The diverse urban population that had made Roman Britain cosmopolitan did not simply disperse into the rural countryside and continue reproducing. Many of them left Britain, returning to other parts of the empire or dying as the infrastructure that had supported urban life collapsed. The rural Iron Age British population, by contrast, simply continued what it had always done, farming and herring and living in them in the same places, largely unaffected by the great civilizational drama that was playing out in the towns and along the wall. The Anglo-Saxon migration that followed the Roman withdrawal is one of the most intensely studied and most contested topics in early medieval British history, and the ancient DNA evidence has reframed debates that had been running for a century without resolution. The old debate, broadly speaking, was between two positions. One position, which dominated Victorian and Edgeworthian scholarship, held that the Anglo-Saxons had essentially exterminated or expelled the Romano-British population from the area that became England, replacing it wholesale with a Germanic people. The other position, which gained ground in the 20th century, held that the Anglo-Saxons were a small elite group whose cultural and linguistic influence was disproportionate to their numbers, and that the population of England remained predominantly Romano-British in ancestry. Both positions have been partially vindicated and partially refuted by the ancient DNA evidence. The replacement was real, not imaginary. In eastern England, the population shift toward continental northwestern European ancestry was substantial, on the order of 60 to 70% in the earliest Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. This is not the signature of a small elite. It is the signature of a mass migration. But the replacement was not complete. It was not uniform. It did not happen everywhere at once. The west and northwest of what is now England retained considerably more Romano-British ancestry. Wales and Cornwall retained the most. The migration created a genetic gradient, not a sharp boundary. The social mechanisms of this migration are also becoming clearer. Studies of burial evidence suggest that in the early Anglo-Saxon period, individuals of continental ancestry and individuals of British ancestry were sometimes buried in the same cemeteries, suggesting they lived in the same communities. Over time, the genetic profile of these communities converged toward the continental ancestry signature, which could reflect intermarriage between the two groups, with differential reproductive success, or it could reflect continued migration from the continent over several generations rather than a single wave. The Anglo-Saxon migration was probably not a single event, but a prolonged process of movement and settlement that played out over 2 or 3 centuries. The cultural transformation that accompanied the demographic shift was dramatic. The Celtic Brittonic languages spoken across land Britain before the Anglo-Saxon period were replaced eventually completely by Old English, a Germanic language ancestral to modern English. This linguistic replacement was so thorough in Eastern England that almost no Celtic words survive in the English vocabulary outside of place names. The rivers and hills retained their Celtic names, the Avon and the Severn and the Thames, but the language of daily life was replaced completely. This linguistic replacement is consistent with the large-scale demographic replacement that the ancient DNA shows in Eastern England. You do not completely replace a language without also significantly replacing the population that speaks it. The Viking contribution to British genetics, already touched on in broad outline, is worth examining in more detail at the regional level, because the variation between regions is enormous and tells an important story about how different the Viking experience was in different parts of Britain. In the English Midlands and the East, the Danelaw was a political entity that controlled a large area for several generations, but the genetic evidence for Viking ancestry in these areas is surprisingly modest. This seems paradoxical until you consider the population dynamics. The existing Anglo-Saxon population of the Danelaw was already several hundred years established and numerically much larger than any Viking settler population. Even intensive Viking settlement would have been demographically diluted by the existing population. Moreover, the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons had similar enough ancestry, both being northern Europeans with high-step Bronze Age and subsequent Germanic migration ancestry, that their genetic signals partially overlap and are difficult to disentangle. In Yorkshire, there is somewhat more evidence for Viking ancestry, consistent with the historical record of extensive Scandinavian settlement around Jorvik. Place names throughout Yorkshire carry the Norse suffix by meaning settlement or farm, as in Whitby and Selby and hundreds of smaller villages. The genetic signal is detectable but not dominant. Viking ancestry in the Yorkshire population is estimated at perhaps 10 to 15% higher than the national average for England, but still a minority component. The most dramatic Viking genetic signal in Britain is as discussed in the Northern Isles. Orne and Shetland were not merely raided or partially settled by Vikings. They were colonized thoroughly by Norse settlers who came from what is now Norway in the 9th century and who established a Norse society that persisted until the 15th century, when the Thalmans were pledged to Scotland as part of a marriage settlement, and the transfer was never redeemed. The linguistic evidence for this colonization is unmistakable. The Norn language, a descendant of Old Norse, was spoken in Orkney until the 18th century, and in Shetland until the 19th. The genetic evidence is equally clear. Modern Orcadians have Norse ancestry levels that put them genetically between mainland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, a position unique in the modern United Kingdom. The Western Isles of Scotland and parts of the northwest Scottish coast also show elevated Norse ancestry, reflecting the presence of the Gal Guide, the foreign Gaels, who were a mixture of Norse and Scottish-Irish ancestry, and the Norse Kingdom of the Isles that was a significant political entity for several centuries before the islands were ceded to Scotland in the 13th century. Place names throughout the Western Isles carry Norse elements. The genetic signal while less dramatic than in Orkney, is still detectable. The Normans, who transformed English culture and politics so profoundly after 1066, deserve one more look in the genetic context. The Normans themselves were already a mixed population when they arrived. The Norse settlers, who had established themselves in Normandy in the 10th century, under Rollo, had by 1066 been living in France for a century and a half, speaking French, adopting Frankish Christianity and administrative practices, intermarrying with the existing Frankish and Romanigish population of Normandy. The genetic profile of the Normans who came to England was therefore not purely Norse. It was a mixture of Norse, Frankish, and older Western European ancestries already significantly diluted from the original steppe and Scandinavian signature. This mixed ancestry, layered on top of the small numbers of Normans who came to England relative to the existing English population, means that any search for a distinctive Norman genetic signal in modern English populations is essentially futile. It is there in principle, but it is so diluted by both mixing before arrival and demographic swamping after arrival that it cannot be reliably identified in individual genomes. The Normans left us the English languages, Norman French vocabulary, its legal traditions, its aristocratic lineages, its cathedrals and castles, but not a discernible genetic fingerprint in the broader population. One aspect of the genetic history of Britain that deserves more attention than it typically receives is the role of disease in shaping the population. The Black Death of the mid-4th century has already been mentioned, but its genetic consequences are worth examining more carefully. The bubonic plague, caused by Yinia pestis, killed perhaps 30 to 50% of the European population, the initial epidemic of 1347 to 1351, and recurred multiple times over the following century. The survivors of this catastrophe were not a random sample of the pre-plague population. They were a biased sample, biased toward individuals whose immune systems happened to be better equipped to handle the specific challenge that Y pests presented. The immune system is genetically encoded in large part through the HLA system, the human leukocyte antigen system, which is the most genetically diverse region of the human genome. The HLA variants that a person carries determine how effectively their immune system recognizes and responds to particular pathogens. Studies have found signals in modern European genomes that are consistent with strong, positive selection at HLA-LO during the medieval period, which is the time frame of the Black Death. The plague survivors who repopulated England in the second half of the 14th century and, throughout the 15th century, were statistically speaking, people whose HLA profiles had happened to provide some degree of resistance to plague. Their descendants, modern British people, may carry a skewed distribution of HLA variants. As a result, the implications of this extend beyond plague resistance. HLA variants that protect against one pathogen sometimes increase susceptibility to others, or are associated with differences in autoimmune disease risk. The elevated rates of certain autoimmune conditions in European populations relative to populations that did not experience the Black Death. Conditions like multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes may partly reflect the selective consequences of the plague epidemics. The Black Death did not just kill people. It reached into the genetic architecture of the immune system of every person alive in England today and shaped it in ways that are still being worked out. The medieval Jewish community of England is another population with a complex and often overlooked place in this story. Jewish communities had been present in England since the Norman conquest, invited by William, the Conqueror, as useful participants in the financial life of his kingdom. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Jewish communities existed in most major English towns and cities: London, York, Lincoln, Winchester, Bristol. They occupied a precarious legal position, defined as the property of the Crown, subject to special taxation, prohibited from owning land, permitted to lend money at interest in ways that the canon law forbade to Christians. Their position was also physically dangerous. The York Massacre of 1190 in which the Jewish community of York was killed by a mob, was one of the most violent anti-Semitic atrocities in medieval England, part of a wave of violence that swept through Jewish communities across the country. In 1290, Edward the Fern expelled then the entire Jewish population of England, an act that removed approximately 15,000 to 20,000 people from the gene pool of Britain at a stroke. Their descendants would not return in significant numbers until the 17th century, when Oliver Cromwell allowed resettlement and larger-scale immigration from Eastern Europe did not occur until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The expulsion of 1290 is a reminder that population history is not only about who arrives and who settles. It is also about who is forced to leave, who is killed, who disappears from the genetic record, not through migration or natural processes, but through deliberate violence and exclusion. The Jewish community of medieval England was a distinct genetic group, different in ancestry, from the surrounding Christian population, and their removal in 1290 left a gap in the genetic composition of Britain that was not filled for centuries. The Flemish weavers who settled in Wales and eastern England during the 12th and 13th centuries represent a smaller but real addition to the genetic history of Britain. The Flemish had a specific professional skill set that made them valuable to English and Welsh lords who wanted to develop textile production. They settled in compact communities, sometimes in areas that had been designated specifically for their use. Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, which remained somewhat distinct from surrounding Welsh communities in its history and character, was among the settlements associated with Flemish immigration. Their genetic contribution to the modern population of Britain is estimated to be small but real. Another thin layer in the accumulation, the deep structure of British genetics, is therefore a geological metaphor waiting to happen. The bottommost stratum, old beyond most imagination, is the Western hunter-gatherer, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed people who walked across Dogland 12,000 years ago. Above it, the Neolithic farmer layer from Anatolia, the builders of Hennes and Long Barrows. Above that, the thick and dominant Beaker Bronze Age layer from the steppe, which accounts for the majority of modern British ancestry. Then the relatively thin Iron Age continuation layer. Then the trace of Roman period diversity. Then the substantial Anglo-Saxon layer in the east. Then the Viking layer in the north and northeast, strongest in Orkney. Then the thin Norman layer at the surface, and threading through all of it, modifying and complicating every stratum, the genetic signatures of selection for lighter skin, for blue eyes, for red hair in the West, for lactase persistence everywhere, for specific immune system variants. The principal component analysis, the statistical technique most commonly used to visualize genetic relationships between populations, produces a picture that is worth describing in words, because it is so spatially intuitive. Imagine a map of Europe. Now imagine a second map, a genetic map on which populations are plotted, not by their geographic location, but by their genetic distance from one another. On this genetic map, the British and Irish populations would sit at the northwestern corner, close to the Scandinavian populations and relatively distant from the southern European populations. Moving southeast across the genetic map, you would first encounter the German, Dutch, and Danish populations, then the French and Belgian populations, then the Central European populations, then the Southern European populations with Italians, Greeks, and Iberians occupying the southeastern portion of the map. The British occupy the northwestern corner because their specific combination of ancestries, high Beaker steppe, substantial Anglo-Saxon, northwestern European, relatively low, Neolithic farmer, places them furthest from the Mediterranean and closest to Scandinavia and Germany in genetic terms. What this means visually is a set of probabilistic tendencies rather than absolutes. The average British person is somewhat more likely than the average Italian to have pale skin, blue eyes, and lighter hair. But there is no trait that is uniquely British or that appears in every British person. There are Britons with dark skin, brown eyes, and dark hair who have been in Britain for many 6 generations, carrying gene combinations that happen to express toward the darker end of the distribution, available in the post-Belbie population. There are Italians, with fair skin and blue eyes, who happen to carry the specific variants that are more common in the north. The genetic differences between populations are differences in frequency, not in presence or absence. This is perhaps the most important single thing to understand about the genetics of human appearance. It is probabilistic, not deterministic. The genes that control skin color, eye color, and hair color produce a range of outcomes depending on which combination of variants an individual carries, and population differences are differences in the frequency distribution of these variants, not absolute distinctions. The British population produces more blue-eyed, pale-skinned individuals on average because it has higher average frequencies of the relevant variants. It does not produce them exclusively, and an individual from any part of the world can carry any combination of these variants. Genetics does not produce the stereotypes that culture has constructed around it. The ancient DNA revolution is still ongoing, and new findings continue to modify and refine the picture. In the last several years, research has pushed back the timeline of some migrations, refined the proportions of different ancestral components, and identified population structures within Britain that were not previously suspected. Each new paper adds detail to the map and occasionally changes an element of the picture in ways that require the whole story to be retold slightly differently. One of the areas of most active current research is the transition from the Mesolithic to the Tus, Neolithic in Britain, the period when the Western hunter-gatherers were replaced by or absorbed into the incoming Neolithic farmers. The details of this transition, whether it was rapid or gradual, whether it involved violence or coexistence, whether the hunter-gatherers and farmers interbred extensively or minimally, are still being worked out from new ancient DNA samples. The current evidence suggests more mixing than the earlier studies implied, with the Neolithic farmers of Britain carrying more WHG ancestry than their continental counterparts, possibly reflecting a period of several generations in which arriving farmers and existing hunter-gatherers interacted before the farmer ancestry came to dominate. Another active area is the precise timing and route of the Beaker migration into Britain. The standard model has the Belbie people arriving from the continental Beaker complex, with the Rhine Delta region and the area of what is now the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, playing a key role as the staging point for the crossing to Britain. But recent research has suggested that the routes may have been more complex, with some Beaker ancestry arriving from the Atlantic coast rather than across the North Sea, and with ongoing movement in both directions across the Channel and the North Sea throughout the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. The picture is becoming more complex as more samples are analyzed, which is generally a sign of science working correctly. The relationship between the British genetic profile and health is another area that is increasingly studied and that has important practical implications. The specific ancestral composition of the British population predisposes it to particular disease risks and protects it from others. The high Beaker steppe ancestry is associated with elevated risk of certain cardiovascular conditions, partly because the metabolic adaptations of a pastoral steppe diet, high in animal fat and protein, may be suboptimal in a modern sedentary population eating processed foods. The high lactase persistence frequency means that the British population can generally tolerate dairy without digestive issues, which has implications for dietary recommendations. The specific HLA distribution shaped by the Black Death may contribute to elevated autoimmune disease rates relative to populations that did not experience comparable selection events. Understanding the genetic history of a population is therefore not merely an academic exercise. It has practical medical implications. If a particular genetic variant associated with a disease risk is unusually common in the British population, for historical reasons, traceable to the Bronze Age or the medieval period, knowing that history helps clinicians understand why the risk exists and potentially how to address it. The ancient DNA revolution is beginning to connect with clinical medicine in ways that could have real consequences for how diseases are prevented and treated in specific populations. The cultural history of British self-perception has run in parallel with, and often in tension, with the genetic reality. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, popular and scholarly understanding of the British past was shaped by assumptions about racial types that now look scientifically illiterate. The concept of a pure Anglo-Saxon race, noble, free, constitutionally inclined toward democracy and liberty, was used to justify everything from the reform of Parliament to the British Empire. The Celts were characterized as emotional and artistic but politically immature, needing the rational governance that only Anglo-Saxon culture could provide. These constructions said nothing true about genetics and everything about the political anxieties of the people who constructed them. The Victorians did not have ancient DNA. They did not have population genetics. They had skull measurements, which they thought revealed racial character, and written sources that they interpreted through a lens of contemporary prejudice. The result was a deeply distorted picture that served ideological purposes far removed from any honest attempt to understand the past. The ancient DNA revolution has demolished that picture and replaced it with something incomparably more interesting and more complicated. A history in which the British Isles have been populated by multiple waves of migrants from multiple directions over 12,000 years, in which identity is a product of geography and circumstance rather than essence, and in which every living Briton carries in their cells a record of a past that is stranger and richer than any nationalist mythology ever captured. The rediscovery of this complexity is one of the most important intellectual achievements of the early 21st century, and it is happening now, in real time, as each new ancient genome is sequenced and each new paper is published. The story of why the British look the way they do is still being written in laboratories in Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and Leipzig, in the petrous bones of people who died before writing existed, in the patient work of scientists who spend their careers decoding messages left by the dead for the living. What those messages say, ultimately, is that difference and connection are not opposites. The British look distinctive because of a specific history, but that history is made entirely of connection. Connection to the steppe via the Beaker migration, connection to northwestern Europe via the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, connection to Anatolia via the Neolithic farmers, connection to the ancient post-glacial hunters via the faint WHG signal that persists in every modern British genome. The distinctiveness is real. The isolation that produced it was always relative, always partial, always punctuated by arrivals and departures and exchanges. Britain was never truly alone. It was never truly separate. It was always the place where certain currents of human movement came to rest for a while, mixing and settling before the next wave arrived. That is the deepest truth the DNA tells. Not isolation, but accretion. Not purity, but layering. Not one people, but many peoples. One after another. Each leaving something behind. Each changing what was already there. Each becoming part of a story that none of them knew they were telling. A story that is still being told tonight in the bodies and the faces of every person who lives on that rain-soaked island off the northwestern coast of Europe. The pale skin is not English. It is not Anglo-Saxon. It is not Celtic. It is the accumulated result of 12,000 years of living at high latitude, of being descended from steppe pastoralists and Atlantic hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers, of being selected by the low winter sun of a northern island, of being shaped by drift on a shore that the rest of the world spent 12,000 years trying to reach, and failing, and trying again. The blue eyes are the eyes of the person who walked across Dogland before the sea rose. They are 12,000 years old, carried forward through every generation, through every invasion and migration and conquest and intermarriage, surviving because they were never lost. Because the same old mutation kept being passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain, stretching back to the time when the North Sea was a plain and Britain was a peninsula. The red hair is the signature of the Atlantic fringe, the westernmost people of a continent at the edge of the world. People who stayed when others moved on. People whose isolation amplified what was already rare until it became almost common. A beacon of deep ancestry, visible on every street corner in Edinburgh and Cork and Cardiff. A memory of genetics, written in color, legible to anyone who knows what they are looking at. All of it together is the answer to the question this story began with. The British look different from other Europeans, not because they are separate, but because of how they are connected, because of which connections happened, in which order, because of when the island formed, and which populations were already there when it did, because of what arrived afterwards, and in what sequence, because of 12,000 years of history that left its record, not in documents or chronicles, but in the bodies of living people, who mostly do not know they are carrying it. Now you do. There is a question that sits underneath all of this history, one that the genetics illuminates but cannot fully answer, and that is the question of what it means to belong to a place. Britain has been populated by migrants from the beginning. Every population that has ever lived there arrived from somewhere else. Even the Western hunter-gatherers who walked across Dogland had themselves migrated northward from Refugia in southern Europe after the Ice Age. The island has never had an aboriginal population in any final or absolute sense. It has had a series of populations, each of which was for its time the people who lived there. And yet the word belonging is not meaningless. It refers to something real, something felt, something that accumulates through generations of living in a place, learning its seasons, burying your dead in its soil, giving your children names for its rivers and its hills. The Western hunter-gatherers belong to Britain in this sense, as completely as any people have ever belonged anywhere. The Neolithic farmers who replaced them came to belong to it too. In the 2,000 years before they were themselves replaced, the Belby people and their Bronze Age descendants built their round barrows on the same hills where the Neolithic long barrows already stood, and in doing so, they were claiming something, asserting a relationship with a landscape that was already layered with the memory of others. This is what the genetic record cannot tell us. It can tell us who was there, and in what proportions and when. It cannot tell us what it felt like to stand on the chalk downland of Wiltshire in the Bronze Age, and look at Stonehenge, built by people whose genes you had largely replaced, but whose monument you had inherited. It cannot tell us what language the Belbia people used to name the rivers and the hills, though the names that have survived into Welsh and the other Celtic languages are probably descended from that language or something very close to it. It cannot tell us what the hunter-gatherers of Dogland thought as they watched the sea rise year by year, covering the land where their parents and grandparents had hunted, turning the familiar landscape of their childhood into open water. What it can tell us is that belonging is always a process, never a state. Every population that has lived in Britain became British by living there, by adapting to the land and the climate and the ecological conditions, by passing on their adaptations to their children. The pale skin of modern Britons is an adaptation. It was not brought fully formed from the steppe, or from Anatolia, or from Germany. It was produced by selection, operating on the populations that lived in Britain at high latitude over many generations, shaping them to the light conditions of a northern island. The people who carry that skin today are the product of that place, as much as they are the product of their various ancestral origins. Britain made them in the same sense that any environment makes the populations that live in it long enough. The climate of Britain, which is milder than its latitude would suggest, thanks to the warming influence of the Gulf Stream, has played a more direct role in shaping the population than is usually recognized. A Britain without the Gulf Stream would be more like Labrador than like France, far colder, far less hospitable. The warmth and moisture that the Atlantic brings to the British Isles makes the island inhabitable at latitudes that would otherwise be far too cold for dense human settlement. But that same warmth and moisture creates a cloud cover that dramatically reduces the available UV radiation compared to continental locations at the same latitude. The sun shines less in Britain than in Sweden. Even though Sweden is further north, the moist Atlantic air masses that keep Britain warm also keep it grey. This persistent cloudiness is directly relevant to the selection pressure for lightkin. The relevant factor for vitamin D synthesis is not temperature, but UVB radiation specifically, and cloud cover blocks UVB. Even when temperatures remain moderate, a population living in the British Isles experience less UVB exposure than populations at similar latitudes on the continental interior, because the continent is drier and sunnier, even at equivalent latitudes. This means the selection pressure for lightkin was, if anything, stronger in Britain than in continental Europe at the same latitude, because the effective UV environment was worse. Over thousands of years, this difference in selection pressure may have contributed to the somewhat lighter average skin tone of the British and Irish populations compared to continental populations at similar or even higher latitudes. The peculiar position of Britain in relation to the Atlantic also shaped its population. History, in a geopolitical sense, that had genetic consequences. The Atlantic coast of Europe, stretching from Portugal through Brittany, Wales, western Scotland and Ireland, was a maritime corridor long before any land routes existed. The sea was not a barrier to these coastal peoples. It was a highway. The genetic affinities between populations along the Atlantic facade of Europe, affinities that predate the later Bronze Age and Iron Age movements, reflect the reality of this maritime connectivity. Welsh people share genetic elements with Breton people in France. Irish people share genetic elements with Basque people in Spain. These connections are old, predating the Celtic language expansion, traceable to the Neolithic and possibly to the late Mesolithic. The concept of an Atlantic genetic zone, a region of shared ancestry along the western edge of Europe, connected by sea travel rather than land movement, is now well established in the literature. Britain and Ireland sit at the northern end of this zone. The communities along the Atlantic facade shared cultural practices, traded goods, and exchanged genes across the sea for thousands of years. The megalithic tomb tradition, the practice of building large communal monuments out of stone, spread along this Atlantic corridor from south to north, reaching Britain and Ireland from Iberia and Brittany and western France. The people who built these tombs were genetically connected to each other across the Atlantic, sharing Neolithic farmer ancestry and older WHG strands in proportions that reflect this coastal connectivity. When the Belbie culture expanded along the same Atlantic route, it reinforced and modified this existing network. The Beaker complex itself originated partly in Iberia, before spreading eastward and some northward, and the Atlantic route was one of the pathways along which it moved. The steppe ancestry that the Belbia people carried was therefore introduced to Britain, partly, through the Atlantic corridor, as well as across the North Sea, creating multiple entry points for what became the dominant ancestry of the post-Neolithic British population. The science of isotope analysis, which is separate from, but complementary to, ancient DNA research, has added another dimension to our understanding of population movement in ancient Britain. When humans eat and drink, the isotopic signatures of the food and water are incorporated into their bones and teeth. Teeth form in childhood and retain the isotopic signature of the place where a person grew up. For life, bones remodel over time and reflect the last decade or so of a person's life. By comparing the isotopic signatures in teeth versus bones from the same individual, researchers can tell whether that person moved during their lifetime and in some cases roughly where they came from. Isotope analysis of individuals from Bronze Age and Iron Age Britain has revealed a surprisingly mobile population. People were moving around the island more than the archaeological record of fixed settlements might suggest. Women, in particular, seem to have been more mobile than men, which is consistent with a pattern of exogamy, the practice of marrying outside one's local community that would have caused women to move from their birth community to their husband's community after marriage. This mobility would have enhanced gene flow between communities and reduced the rate at which local founder effects could accumulate, though the geographic isolation of some communities, particularly on islands and in mountain valleys, would have worked in the opposite direction. The Roman roads that crisscrossed Britain increased mobility further. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Britain had an extensive road network that connected its provincial cities and military installations. Travel time across the island was dramatically reduced. The road network facilitated the movement of troops, merchants, and administrators, but it also facilitated the movement of ordinary people in ways that must have gradually increased gene flow between previously more isolated communities. The Roman roads did not survive the collapse of Roman administration intact, but they influenced the routes that medieval tracks and eventually modern roads followed, creating a legacy of connectivity that has lasted to the present day. The medieval period, despite its political turbulence and its recurrent epidemics, also saw significant internal migration in Britain. The growth of towns drew people from the surrounding countryside. The monasteries and convents established communities of people who had come from various locations and were celibate, which had the effect of removing them from the reproductive population, but also the effect of concentrating people from diverse origins in specific places. The wool trade connected rural communities in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, and the Welsh marches to urban markets in Norwich and London, and eventually to continental markets in Dyfed, Flanders, and Italy. And this commercial connectivity encouraged movement of people as well as goods. The transformation of Britain that began with the Black Death in the mid-4th century and continued through the 15th and 16th centuries was not only demographic in the sense of killing large numbers of people, it was also transformative in the sense of restructuring the labor market in ways that encouraged geographic mobility. With a third to a half of the population dead, labor was suddenly scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who had previously been bound to particular manors could, and increasingly did, move to where wages were higher. The legal and social structures that had tied rural people to specific places began to loosen, and with that loosening came increased internal migration and increased gene flow between communities that had previously been more isolated from each other. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century brought another wave of migration to Britain, this time of religious refugees from the continent. Huguenots from France, fleeing Catholic persecution, settled in London and other English Protestants. In the late 16th and 17th centuries, Dutch and Flemish Protestants came for similar reasons. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 brought a large wave of Huguenot refugees to Britain. Some estimates suggesting as many as 50,000 people. They settled primarily in London, but also in other English cities where they brought skills in textile production, watchmaking, and other crafts. Their genetic contribution to the modern population is small in percentage terms, but real. And their cultural contribution, the Huguenot family names that appear throughout the English population, the Beaumont and Lev and Martineau families, is still visible. The 18th century and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution brought the largest internal migration Britain had ever seen, as hundreds of thousands of people moved from rural areas to the new industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Bradford, and dozens of smaller towns grew from villages or modest market towns to major industrial cities in the space of 2 or 3 generations. The people who moved to these cities came from all over Britain and from Ireland, and they mixed and intermarried in ways that blurred the regional genetic distinctions that had accumulated over centuries. A working-class family in Victorian Manchester might have grandparents from rural Lancashire, from Yorkshire, from Wales, and from County Cork, all within a single generation. The Irish famine of the 1840s drove mass immigration to Britain as well as to North America. Irish migrants settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, London, and many other British cities. They brought with them the specific genetic profile of the Irish population: high Beaker steppe ancestry, high WHG component, low Anglo-Saxon, and they added it to the already mixing urban gene pool. The genetic distance between Irish and mainland English populations is real, but not enormous, reflecting their shared deep ancestry, and the mixing of Irish immigrants with the existing British urban population was biologically unremarkable, even as it was culturally significant. The 20th century brought immigration to Britain from further afield than any previous period. The British Empire, at its greatest extent, had connected Britain to populations across South Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. The dissolution of the empire after the Second World War coincided with a period of labor shortage in Britain, and the British government actively encouraged immigration from Commonwealth countries to fill the gap. The Windrush generation, arriving from the Caribbean from 1948 onwards, was the beginning of a wave of immigration that would over several decades transform the demographic profile of Britain's cities. South Asian immigration, primarily from India and Pakistan, but also from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, followed in the 1950s and 1960s. West African immigration increased from the 1960s onwards. East African Asian immigration, as communities of South Asian descent were expelled from Uganda and Kenya in the early 1970s, added another strand. By the end of the 20th century, the major cities of Britain were among the most ethnically diverse in the world, carrying, within their populations, the genetic signatures of populations from every continent. This is the contemporary layer of the geological metaphor. The Beaker stratum is still there, the thickest layer, the foundation. The Anglo-Saxon layer is there, significant and clearly visible. The Viking layer is there, thin in most places, thick in Orkney. All the other layers are there, each one thinner than the last. And now above all of them is being deposited a new layer, the layer of the late 20th and early 21st century, diverse in its origins to a degree that would have been literally unimaginable to the Belbia people, or the Romans, or the Normans, or the Victorians. What this new layer will look like to geneticists in 3,000 years, if there are geneticists, then is impossible to predict. The mixing of populations that is happening in contemporary Britain is producing in the left for new children of mixed ancestry couples genetic combinations that have never existed before in the history of the island. A child with one parent of Nigerian ancestry and one parent of Welsh ancestry carries a combination of ancient African and ancient Belbia steppe and Iron Age, British and possibly WHG ancestry that is genuinely novel in human history on that island. Whether this novelty will be visible in 3,000 years as a distinct stratum, or whether the mixing will continue until it is invisible, depends on patterns of intermarriage and social integration that cannot be foreseen. What can be said is that the process is continuous. There has never been a time when Britain's population was static, when no one was arriving and no one was leaving, when the gene pool was closed and fixed. The notion of a fixed British identity, genetic or cultural, is a fantasy that the evidence of history, ancient and modern, comprehensively refutes. Britain has always been made by movement, by the coming and going of people, by the mixing and the separating, by the island that connects as much as it isolates. The sea around it has always been both barrier and gateway, depending on who was doing the crossing and why. The face of Britain, the literal face, the distribution of skin colors and eye colors and hair, colors that you see on its streets and in its schools and on its buses, is therefore a snapshot of a process, not a fixed reality. It looks as it does tonight, because of what happened 12,000 years ago, and 4,000 years ago, and 1,500 years ago, and 50 years ago. All of it accumulated in the same bodies, all of it expressed through the same basic biological machinery of pigmentation and bone, and stature. It will look different in 100 years, and different again in 1,000. The snapshot will have changed, as it has always changed, because the process never stops. Understanding this does not diminish anything. It does not make the history less interesting or the people less real. It makes them more real, because it replaces a fantasy of fixity with the truth of contingency. The red-haired woman on the Edinburgh bus is carrying a gene variant that traces back to the Atlantic fringe people of the Mesolithic, amplified by drift on an island at the edge of the world. And she is also carrying Beaker steppe ancestry and WHG ancestry, and possibly a small fraction of Norse ancestry, and possibly a barely detectable trace of the Neolithic farmers who built the monuments before the steppe people came. She is all of it at once. She is 12,000 years of history, walking around in the rain, and so is everyone else. The light in Britain is different from the light anywhere else. Anyone who has lived there, and then moved away, knows this. It is a low light, a diffuse light, a light that comes through clouds rather than directly from the sun for most of the year. It is the light of a high-latitude island wrapped in Atlantic moisture, a light that has shaped every landscape painting, and every piece of Gothic stained glass, and every garden ever planted there. It is also, in a very literal sense, the light that shaped the people. The low UVB light of that cloudy northern island, selected over thousands of years for the ability to make the most of whatever light was available. And the bodies of British people today are the product of that selection, as surely as the architecture and the art and the horticulture are products of the same light, working on different media. There is something fitting about the fact that a country famous for its clouds and its rain should have produced through the mechanism of those same clouds and that same rain one of the most distinctive pigmentation profiles in the world. The paleness of the skin is not incidental to the climate. It is a response to it, written in genetics over millennia, as direct a consequence of place as the sprain of the grass, or the gray of the stone walls, or the silver of the streams running off the uplands. Britain made its people in its own image, insofar as a place can make a people, and the people, carrying the marks of that making in their cells, look back at the landscape that made them, and see themselves in it, and belong. The geneticists who study ancient DNA sometimes talk about the experience of reading a genome from a person who died thousands of years ago and finding in it something recognizable, a variance that is common today, a pattern that connects the ancient individual to their living descendants in an unbroken chain. There is something in that recognition that transcends science. It is the experience of deep time becoming personal, of history losing its abstraction and becoming embodied, of the dead reaching forward through generations, beyond counting to touch the living in a way they never intended and could never have imagined. When you look at a person with blue eyes in Edinburgh, or red hair in Dublin, or pale skin burning on a Brighton beach, you are seeing the end point of that chain. You are seeing 12,000 years of history made visible. You are seeing Dogland sunk beneath the North Sea, but still present in the genomes of its descendants. You are seeing the steppe, vast and flat and ancient, carried westward by people who had no idea where they were going, or what their children's children would look like. You are seeing the island doing what islands do, amplifying, preserving, shaping, holding fast to what the sea has brought, while the sea keeps everything else away. That is the story. It did not begin with the Romans. It did not begin with the Celts. It did not begin with the Anglo-Saxons, or the Vikings, or the Normans. It began when the ice melted, and the water rose, and Britain became an island. And the people who were already there, dark-skinned and blue-eyed, and walking a world that no longer exists, found themselves separated from the rest of their kind by the sea and began without knowing it to become something new. Everything that followed was a continuation of that becoming. Every migration, every conquest, every settlement, every plague, every marriage across a cultural boundary, every child born to parents from different ends of the island or different ends of the world was another chapter in the same story. The story has no ending. It has only the latest chapter, which is being written now in the cities and the countryside, and the schools and the hospitals and the DNA laboratories of a small island off the northwestern coast of Europe, 12,000 years into its improbable layered, unfinished life. The bones do not lie. The petrous bone, sealed in the skull, carrying its ancient DNA through centuries of cold and dark, and chemistry that would destroy any other record, does not lie. It carries the truth of who was there, and when, and where they came from, and what they contributed to the people who came after. The ancient DNA laboratories of the world are reading that truth now, genome by genome, site by site, era by era, building up a picture of human movement and settlement, and replacement and mixture, that no documentary record could ever provide, and no mythology could have imagined. Britain is one of the most thoroughly studied regions in the world in terms of ancient DNA, partly because of the density of archaeological sites, and partly because of the quality of preservation in the cool, damp soils of the British Isles. The picture that has emerged from this study is one of the richest and most detailed in the world. It shows a place that has been populated and repopulated and transformed again and again by people from elsewhere. People who came by boat and on foot and on horseback. People who came for land and for trade, and because they were displaced, and because they were following their animals, and because they were soldiers, and because they were slaves. All of them are in the record. All of them contributed. The British genome is a library of arrivals,